Meseches Moed Katan Daf Yud Vez continues the discussion of the halachos of Chol HaMoed and which types of works are permitted and which are forbidden. There are two mishnayos on the daf. From the beginning of the daf until the first mishnah is discussing whether a nachri is allowed to do work on behalf of a Yisrael, and what situations it's permitted, what situations it's allowed, and what type of work contracts are allowed. The mishnah will take us back to the halachas of something which is lost, when you're allowed to do a certain work on Chol HaMoed because it's going to be lost or destroyed. The Gemara will combine that again with the halachos of having a nachri do work for you. And along the way, we're going to have a lot of halachos about when we're stricter, when the halachos are stricter for someone who's an adam chashuv, and other people will learn from him, and therefore he has to hold himself to a higher standard. So the Gemara begins by discussing hiring a nachri to do work for you, and it divides it into three levels: doing work for you on Shabbos, doing work for you on Yom Tov, and doing work for you on Chol HaMoed. So Gemara says doing work for you on Shabbos, if you're going to hire him to do the job, get the job finished, completed, and paying you for the job, I don't care when you do it, so technically that should be mutter. You're not asking him to work for you on Shabbos, you're just asking him to do the job, and he decides when he wants to do it. However, you can't have a situation where it appears that you hired him on Shabbos, that the casual observer will seem that you hired him on Shabbos, therefore it can't be visible that he's doing work for you. So it can't be within your tchum, because people will see and they'll think that you hired him for Shabbos or on Shabbos. It can't be within the tchum of any Jewish city, because again, those Jews will have that ruling. So you have to make sure that that's not going to happen. And it can't be on Chol HaMoed, because in Chol HaMoed people could travel to the city, and then they could see that he's doing the work, and they will assume that you hired him to do the work on Chol HaMoed. Now, Shabbos, therefore, you don't have that problem. On Yom Tov, you also don't have the problem, because people aren't going to travel outside the Tchum on Yom Tov. So therefore, that would be permitted. However, what comes out of here is that you cannot hire a nachri to perform a job for you on his own time on Chol HaMoed, no matter where he is, because it's going to appear that you hired him to do it specifically then. Now, the Gemara has a related incident. The Gemara says that Mar Zutra hired Nachum to build a palace for him, to build a big house. And they ended up working on Shabbos. Now, he had paid them to do just the job, so technically that was permitted. Certainly, if it was outside the Tchum, was permitted, because nobody could go there. Now, the Gemara says, though, that Rav Safra and Rav Huna Bar Chinna would not go in there, and even Mar Zutra himself would not go in there when he found out that it was built on Shabbos. The Gemara says, why not? It was outside the Tchum, it was on Shabbos, nobody could go there. What's the issue? It should be mutter. The Gemara gives two reasons. Either because he was an adam chashuv, he was a respectable person and people would learn a wrong halacha from him, he has to hold himself to a higher standard, or because Mar Zutra had actually helped them by supplying them with straw to make bricks. Of course, he did that before Shabbos, but he didn't think that they were going to do it on Shabbos, the actual construction, and then when he found out that they did, he decided the fact that he helped them means that he helped malacha to be done on Shabbos, and therefore it was aser, and he would not use it afterwards. Okay, now the Gemara has some other similar halachos about a nachri doing work for Yisrael on Shabbos, Yom Tov, or Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara says that Rav Chama allowed the waiters in the house of the Reish Galusa to fix tables on Chol HaMoed. Why? So the reason is because they didn't get paid, they didn't get a salary. Their compensation was that they were allowed to eat from the meals that they served. Therefore, they really were fixing the table for their own benefit, and it's not a problem of him working on behalf of a Jew. All right, now the Gemara brings a brisa. The Gemara says you're allowed to have a contract with a nachri to work on Chol HaMoed. So you're allowed to set up the contract on Chol HaMoed. You're allowed to make the arrangement, but they have to do the work only after Chol HaMoed. You cannot have it that they will arrange that the work should be done on Chol HaMoed. General rule is anything that you're not allowed to do on Chol HaMoed, you're not allowed to have an achri do for you on Chol HaMoed. Now the Gemara says another brisa. You're allowed to make a contract on Chol HaMoed. You're allowed to set up the arrangement on Chol HaMoed. You're allowed to strike the deal, but you can't measure out the materials and weigh them out and count them out and do any of these things in a normal way that you do it on a regular weekday. Now, the Gemara brings another brisa. This is talking about a specific malacha. This is talking about mating two animals. You have a male and a female, let's say a cow or a horse or a donkey. So there's a practice of where you literally mount the male and the female in order that they should become pregnant and have more animals. But you cannot do that. That's considered a malacha. So you're not allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed. You're also not allowed to do it with a bechor, a firstborn animal that has kedusha. You're not allowed to do it with psula mikdashin. That's a carbon that became invalid because it got a mum. It still has kedusha. You're not allowed to work it, and this is considered to be work. Now, another brisa on that topic says you're not allowed to actually mate the animals. And Rabbi Yehuda says, though, if the female donkey comes into her time when she needs to be mated, then you're allowed to on Chol Hamoed, because if she doesn't get mated, she will cool off, and you're going to lose this opportunity for her to give birth. Other female animals don't have to have the male actually mated to them. You could just put them together with males in a corral, and they will take care of what they need to take care of on their own. Now, another thing you may need with animals is to have them fertilize your field. That's you want to pen in animals on a specific field you need fertilized, and their waste material will provide fertilizer for the field. So you're allowed to do that. So you're not allowed to do that on Chol Hamoed, you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos, you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov. However, if a group of Nachrim came with their animals and they pastured them in your field in order to fertilize it, you're allowed to let them do it. Obviously, they're expecting payment. You're not allowed to help them. You're not allowed to provide guards to keep the animals in the field. You're not allowed to assist them in any way. Now, if you have a deal with them that they're going to do it per week, per month, per year, or per Shemitah cycle, then they're not specifically doing the work at a time. It's a general contract for a long period. The fact that they're working on Shabbos, Chol Hamoed, or Yom Tov is not a problem because you didn't set it up for them to do it then, and therefore you're allowed to help them. You're allowed to give them guards to keep their fields in that specific spot. All right, now, says Rebbe that if a guy is going to do something for you on Shabbos, it could be only if he expects to get a favor in return, not if he expects to get paid in return. On Yom Tov, he's allowed to work if he expects to get food in return and not actual money. And on Chol Hamoed, they're allowed to do work if you're going to pay them with an actual salary. And this is all, of course, where you didn't hire him, but he came on his own and he worked, and this is what he was expecting in return, then you're allowed to pay him afterwards. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah. Mishnah discusses, similar to our previous Mishnah, which discussed where oil was squeezed or is ready to be squeezed from olives, and it's going to spoil or be destroyed if you don't do it right away in Chol Hamoed, and you didn't schedule it for them. Then you're allowed to do it to prevent loss. Here we have a very similar discussion about wine. So the Mishnah says if you have wine that was already squeezed out of the vat, and now it's in the large container where the wine, the squeezed grape juice flows, and you have to now move it into barrels and seal the barrels, otherwise it's going to spoil. So you're not allowed to schedule it to happen on Chol Hamoed, but if something struck you became an aval and you couldn't take care of it, or some other unavoidable situation happened, or you hired workers and they didn't show up, so then therefore now you're stuck with a situation where you have to do it on Chol Hamoed or you're going to get a loss. You're allowed to pour it into barrels and seal them up. Now here you have Machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi says you're allowed to do it in a normal way. Seal the barrel, move it in a normal way you are. You don't have to do a shinoi because it's a situation of loss. To prevent the loss, you don't have to do a shinoi. Rabbi Yehuda, though, says you have to do it with a shinoi, and therefore you cannot seal the barrel with a regular cover. You have to just make a cover of boards that you're going to put on at the top of it. Okay, now the Gemara begins. The Gemara wants to know why do you have to teach me the same halachos about oil and about wine? Same exact thing. Just say one and I'll know the other. You don't have to list every material. So Gemara says no. Oil is more expensive than wine, it's more valuable. If I wouldn't tell you the machlokas in both cases, I would not think that the machlokas exists. As far as oil, I would think that Rabbi Yehuda agrees you don't have to have a shinoi, and as far as wine, I would think that Rabbi Yosi agrees you do have to have a shinoi because it's not as valuable. And therefore I have to list both cases specifically. Now, the Gemara notes that there is a Tana out there who seems to say, well, it doesn't quote the Brisa verbatim, it says there is a Tana that holds that when you are doing work on Chol Hamoed to prevent a loss, you have to have a shinoi. So Gemara says that's not Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi also you don't have to have a shinoi like we see in this Mishnah. What's the halacha? Gemara says Rabbi Yosi, the halacha is like Rabbi Yosi. You don't have to have a shinoi. Gemara says that they asked Menachem Bar Yitzchak, when you're sealing a barrel of beer, do you have to do a shinoi or not? So he said, well, we already said the halacha is like Sinai. We have Sinai, that is, who said that the halacha is like Rabbi Yosi. Sinai is Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, it said the halacha is like Rav Yosi. So the halacha is like Rav Yosi. What are you asking me? He says, no, we're asking about beer. Maybe beer is different. He said it about wine. So Rav Nachman said there's no difference. If you leave your beer unsealed, you're going to have a tremendous loss, just as if you leave your wine unsealed. Just like Abaye says, the Gemara quotes Abaye, who said that his mother, it's not his birth mother, it's his adoptive mother, she said that 6 sa barrel of sealed beer is better than an 8 sa barrel of unsealed beer, because you're going to lose it, it's not valuable. If it's not properly sealed, it's going to spoil. All right, now the Gemara has 2 descriptions of the halachos of Chol Hamoed in general. So Rav Chaim Bar Goria says, in the name of Rav, the halachos of Chol Hamoed are like the halachos of the Kusim. So Kusim, they kept certain halachos very strictly, and other halachos they didn't keep at all or didn't keep properly. So you cannot learn anything from the way Kusim kept one halacha to the way they kept other halachos. They kept some and not others. So the halachos of Chol Hamoed are similar, not that you don't have to keep them, chas v'shalom, but that you can't learn from one to the other. Every case seems to have its own set of rules, if you can't learn from one to the other. The Gemara says, Rav Daniel bar Katinas, and then they have something similar. Halachos of Chol Hamoed are like a barren woman. They don't give birth. You can't get one from another. You know one doesn't mean you know the other. An example of that is coating the inside of a container with tar to make sure that it's waterproof. So Shmuel says you're allowed to coat a small barrel, a small jug, but not a big barrel. And Rav Dimi of Nardos says the opposite. You're allowed to coat a big barrel, but not a small jug. Well, what's the reason for this? So according to Shmuel, do something that requires less work. Tircha is also on Chol Hamoed. You're not allowed to do something that requires a lot of work. Therefore, a big barrel you're not allowed to do. Small barrel, small jug you could do. Now, Rav Dimi of Nardos says no. The issue here is how much loss are you going to have? You're going to lose a tremendous amount if you don't coat a big barrel. Therefore, that you're allowed to do. Small jug, not such a big loss, and therefore you're allowed to. So again, there's very different ways of looking at the same case. You can't learn one halacha from the other. The Gemara has another way of describing the halachas of Chol Hamoed. The Gemara says they're similar to the halachas of Shabbos in 2 out of 3. In Shabbos, every potential malacha is either aser deraisa, and it's punishable by kares if it's done on purpose, or by carbon chatas if it's done b'shegeg. That you don't have in Hilchos Chol Hamoed. Hilchos Chol Hamoed has no einish because it's learned all from a mitzvahs asay, and mitzvahs asay do not have an einish, at least not b'dei adam. However, in Hilchos Shabbos you also have something which is pater aval aser. It's aser to do, but you don't get any punishment for it if you violate it. That you have in Hilchos Chol Hamoed, and then you have something else which is totally mutter, other things which would appear to be aser, but they're not mutter. So Chol Hamoed is like that. It has these two things. It has pater aval aser, it has things that are forbidden, and things that are permitted. There are, however, no punishment involved. All right, now the Gemara refers back to Rav Yossi's halacha. Rav Yossi had said that you're allowed to prevent loss by sealing the barrel in the normal way. So Gemara says that a bunch of workers harvested Rav Huna's grain on Chol Hamoed. So his son, Rabbah, asked his father, he said, how are you allowed to do that? We have a brisa which makes it clear that you're not allowed to harvest on Chol Hamoed under any circumstances. The brisa says there are a lot of different types of things that are permitted on Yom Tov. For example, Chol Hamoed needs, something you need for Chol Hamoed is permitted on Yom Tov. So you're allowed to grind grain into flour if you need the flour for Yom Tov. Now, if you don't, then it's asur. Now, besides for that, something which is going to be lost or destroyed, you're allowed to do on Chol Hamoed. That, however, is limited. It's only something which is detached from the ground. Something which is still growing from the ground, you can't do any malacha, you can't harvest it, because that's going to create too much of a commotion. Even something which is harvested and you want to thresh it, you have to do without a commotion. You're allowed to harvest, you're allowed to gather, thresh, winnow, choose the good from the bad from the good. You're allowed to do all these malachos as long as you don't use oxen for the threshing, because that makes another commotion. Now, somebody doesn't have anything to eat, so he's allowed to harvest things that are attached to the ground. For him, we make an exception because he needs food. It's tzarech ochel nefesh. He needs food. However, he also is not allowed to use oxen for the threshing because that big commotion is not allowed. What you see from here, though, is that this brisa said that you're not allowed to harvest. So how could Rav Huna have his workers harvest? That was a question that was asked. So the Gemara says that Rav Huna answered to his son, Rabbah, he said, this is a das yachad. This is one opinion. This is the opinion of Rav Yossi. Rav Shimon Gamliel quotes Rav Yossi, who says that a crop which is attached to the ground, you're not allowed to harvest it, even if it's going to be lost. The commotion is too great, the work is too great, even if you're going to lose it, you're not allowed to harvest something which is attached. Only something which is detached are you allowed to do work on it in order to prevent loss. So Gemara says, hold on a second. This is Rav Yossi. If it's Rav Yossi, how come you can't use oxen? Well, we understood the whole problem with threshing with oxen is because you need to do a shinoi. You can't do it in a normal way. But Rav Yossi holds you don't have to do a shinoi. So how can you tell me that this brisa is Rav Yossi? Gemara says, no, the issue is not that you have to have a shinoi. The issue is that it's too much of a commotion if you use oxen. And therefore, you this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Even though there's no problem of needing a shina because you don't, there is a problem that you're going to create a commotion. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to more halachos you're allowed to do on Chol Hamoed. So the Gemara quotes a brisa. It says you're allowed to grind flour, cut branches, or brew beer on Chol Hamoed only if you need it for Chol Hamoed. If you don't need it for Chol Hamoed, you're not allowed to. And you're not allowed to play games. You're not allowed to make a trick and say, well, I need it for Chol Hamoed, and then do much more than you need and then use the leftovers for after. That you're not allowed to do. So Gemara says, hold on a second, you're telling me I can't make tricks, but there's a brisa that says I am allowed to make tricks. There's a brisa that says you're allowed to brew beer on Chol Hamoed even if you already have beer. You're allowed to make beer, and you're going to use the new beer. You're going to say, oh, I'm using it for Chol Hamoed, even though you already have other beer that you need. That way you'll have more beer than you need just for Chol Hamoed. So why are you telling me that I'm not allowed to make tricks if this brisa says I am allowed to make tricks? So the brisa says, there's a third, our brisa that says Machlokes Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda against the Tanakama, whether or not you're allowed to be ma'arimin. You're allowed to make a trick and do a malacha that you don't have to do as long as you're going to use that malacha for Chol Hamoed. Now, the Gemara says about what the halacha is, and this will take us into the discussion of an Adam Chashav. So the Gemara says that Rav's harvest was harvested, Rav's grain was harvested, and Shmuel was upset about it. Shmuel objected. So the Gemara wants to know why. So it says, well, maybe Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel holds that you're not allowed to do any harvesting. You're not allowed to cut down anything which is attached to the ground, like we said earlier. Shmuel says, no, Shmuel does not hold like Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel has a different problem with this, and that is because it was wheat. It will be a type of grain other than wheat that will be lost, it will be destroyed if you wouldn't harvest it on Chol Hamoed, and therefore it's a davar of it. This was wheat. Wheat will dry and fall. It's going to keep if you leave it a few more days, not a problem. So Gemara says, so then why did Rav do it if it was wheat? Gemara says, Rav held that he was allowed to because he was in a situation of someone who doesn't have anything to eat. He's allowed to harvest, even if it's not a situation of loss, he's allowed to harvest on Chol Hamoed. Now, Shmuel either didn't know that Rav was in a situation of not having anything to eat, or he held that since Rav was an Adam Chashav, he has to hold himself to a higher standard, because people are going to learn a wrong halacha from that. The Gemara has other cases of people who have to hold themselves to a higher standard because they're an Adam Chashav. Gemara says that Rav Yehuda Nesiya did two things. He went out to his chatzar on Shabbos wearing a ring, a signet ring made out of a special wood called madosh wood, and he drank water that was heated up by a cook who was a nachri, an arma. The Rav Ami was upset about both of these things. So Gemara says, why was he upset? As far as the ring goes, you're right, it's muktzah. A signet ring is used for signing documents, which is muktzah on Shabbos, but you're allowed to move it. It's muktzah because it's a kli shemachta l'isser. It's used for forbidden purposes, but you're allowed to move that if you need it for something, or if you need to get it out of the way of something. So that's probably why Rav Yehuda Nasi was wearing it. So why is he upset about that? Now, as far as cooking the water, the only problem with cooking being performed by a nachri is that it's bishul akum. Jews are not allowed to eat food that was cooked by a nachri. However, this is water, and water can be drunk raw. You don't have to cook water in order to drink it, and therefore there is no isser of bishul akum on that. Bishul akum only applies to something which cannot be consumed without the cooking procedure. So why was he upset? So the Gemara says because he wasn't Adam Chashav. He felt that an Adam Chashav has to be more machmer. Now, which of these two things was he upset about because of an Adam Chashav? It's a machlokes rishonim if it applies to one or both of these. Okay. Further on topic, the Gemara quotes of Chanal says in the name of Rav, you're allowed to cut down a palm tree, even if all you need is the sawdust. The fact that it's a big tircha is not a problem. If you need sawdust on Chol Hamoed, you let it cut down a tree. And Baya, though, was upset about that, and he cursed anybody who cut down palm trees just for sawdust. The Gemara says Rav Ashi owned a forest in a place called Shalnaya. He went to cut down the tree because he needed sawdust. Rav Shila of Shalnaya said, what are you doing? You hold like Rav Chananel that you're allowed to cut down a tree just for sawdust on Chol Hamoed, but don't you know that Baya was upset about it, and he cursed anybody who did. So the Gemara said that I didn't hear it. Rav Ashi said, I didn't hear it, by which he meant to say, I don't hold that way, I'm not concerned about it. So he started chopping, and the axe slipped, and he almost chopped off his own leg. So when that happened, he understood there was a warning that he better back off, and he went home, keeping Abaye's ruling. Okay, now more things you're allowed to do on Chol Hamoed. So Rav Yehuda says you're allowed to uproot flax, cut down hops, and uproot shumshum plants. Now, what's the reason for this? Abai says to Rav Yosef, I understand flax you have to uproot because you need that on Chol Hamoed. You need it to cover your food to keep them fresh. Hops you allowed to harvest, you got to cut them down to make beer. But shumshum plants, the seeds are useless until they're dried, so you're not going to be able to use it on Chol Hamoed. So why should you be allowed to harvest those on Chol Hamoed? My answer is there are some that are dried. Within the shell, you have a couple that are dried. You're allowed to therefore harvest it for the sake of using those. Now, we had said that a Talmid Chacham or Adam Chashav has to hold himself to a higher standard. The Gemara shows why, that Rav Yanai owned an orchard, and the time to pick the fruits came up on Chol Hamoed, otherwise they would be lost, so he picked them on Chol Hamoed, and then next year everybody said, hey, Rav Yanai picked his fruits on Chol Hamoed last year, I'm going to leave my fruits to be picked on Chol Hamoed, and I'm going to say, oh, I have to pick my fruits, it's Chol Hamoed, and they're going to get lost, and that's, of course, forbidden. You're not allowed to schedule it or leave it on purpose to be done on Chol Hamoed, and therefore Rav Yanai did not eat from his orchard that entire year. He left it for the poor as a step to do tshuva. All right, now we get to our last Mishnah. It's the next Mishnah, and towards the end of the Daf, Mishnah says you're allowed to bring fruits into your house in order to prevent them from being stolen. If you have flax that's soaking in order to separate the parts of the plant from the fibers, you're allowed to take that out of the soaking because otherwise it'll be destroyed. However, of course, you're not allowed to schedule the soak of a Chol Hamoed. You're not allowed to leave it to be done on a Chol Hamoed on purpose. If somebody does leave it to be done on a Chol Hamoed, then their profit is going to be lost. Remember, quotes a brisa that adds a halacha. You're allowed to bring the fruits into your house to prevent loss, to prevent them from being stolen, only in tzina, not for hesia. It cannot be a majorly visible thing. You got to do it in private. Remember, quotes of Yosef, who had some heavy beams. They were left outdoors. They were going to get destroyed. They had to be brought indoors. So he went and he brought it inside the house during the day. So Abai said, you're supposed to do it in private. You should have done it at night. He answered, he said, at night it would have been a bigger commotion. It would have needed more people, and they would have had to have lights, torches. That would have been a greater commotion. This way is the most bitzina solution to the problem.